The night air pressed heavy against the wooden walls of the small house. A faint rattle of shutters mixed with the restless cry of a baby lying in a crib near the window. Moonlight cut through the glass in broken slants, falling across the floor where a German shepherd lay, ears pricked, eyes fixed on shadows that did not belong. The baby's chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, a hiccup between sobs, fingers clenching at nothing. The dog shifted, muscles taut, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Something was wrong. The air smelled of damp wood and oil, sharp and metallic. Outside, beyond the fragile line of fence and soil, water surged in the swollen river, battering at its banks with relentless force. The baby whimpered, a sound that pierced deeper than any command. The dog's head turned instantly, gaze locking on the fragile form bundled in thin blankets. The floor trembled with the first shudder of collapse, wood groaning under strain. The river had reached its breaking point. The baby cried louder, and in that cry was need, helpless and raw. The shepherd stepped closer, pressing its muzzle against the crib's edge. Danger was here. Protection had begun. The morning had begun in stillness, the kind of quiet that carries a weight, as though the world itself was listening for something just out of reach. The baby stirred in his crib, the small flutter of arms and the soft gurgle of breath breaking the silence. Beside him, stretched out on the worn wooden floor, the German shepherd lifted its head, ears forward, eyes sharp. The dog waited, not for command, not for routine, but for the rhythm of the baby's waking. The house was humble, wood scarred by years of weather, its roof patched and patched again. Light filtered in through curtains sewn by hand, spilling in fractured patterns across the floorboards. Dust hung suspended in the air, drifting with each shift of the shepherd's breath. The baby's cry came, thin but insistent. The dog rose in one smooth motion, nails clicking softly against the planks. It padded to the crib and peered in, gaze intent on the fragile body tangled in cloth. The baby's fists flailed, striking at the air. A low whine escaped the shepherd's throat, and the sound alone quieted the child for a moment. Their bond was wordless, stitched not by language, but by presence, by the unseen tether between vulnerability and guardianship. The baby reached out, hand clumsy and trembling, brushing against the shepherd's fur. The dog leaned closer, allowing the tiny fingers to grip a strand. The baby tugged, not cruelly, only with the strength of innocence. The shepherd endured it without flinch. For the dog, pain meant nothing if it came from this child. Outside, the river moved beneath the old bridge, its surface restless even in daylight. The sound of water had become a constant presence, sometimes soothing, sometimes ominous. In recent days it had grown louder, deeper, like the rumble of something awakening. The villagers muttered about it in passing, voices lowered when they spoke of rising currents. Yet here, in this house, there was no space for those warnings. Here was only the baby's laughter when the shepherd pressed its cold nose against his cheek, only the steady rise and fall of shared breaths, when sleep reclaimed them both. The shepherd knew the baby's world better than any adult could. He knew the pattern of hunger before the cry came, the twitch in small legs that meant discomfort, the silence that carried danger more surely than any wail. He watched always, guarding from shadows no one else noticed. When the wind rattled shutters, he stood at the... When footsteps passed too near the house, he pressed close to the crib until they were gone. The bond was a lifeline forged without ceremony. No one taught the baby to trust the dog. No one taught the dog to give his life without hesitation. It was instinct sharpened by love, as pure as the current that threatened beyond the walls. The day moved with slow certainty. The baby napped, the shepherd lay stretched beside the crib, and the world spun unaware of what was gathering. Clouds thickened at the horizon, gray and swollen. The first drops tapped against the roof, a warning ignored. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound, but his eyes never left the baby. When the storm came, it would not ask permission, and when it came, the bond between child and dog would be tested, stretched to breaking, forced to prove what it had always promised, that one life was tied unshakably to the other. The storm arrived without hesitation. The first strike of thunder rolled through the valley like the splitting of stone, rattling the shutters of the small house until they slammed against the frame. The baby stirred in his crib, startled awake, eyes wide in the dim light. His mouth opened with a cry, high and sharp, slicing into the roar of the storm. The German shepherd was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling from his chest as though he could challenge the sky itself. He paced to the window, nose pressed against the glass, fogging it with quickened breath. Rain hammered against the panes, each drop a drumbeat of warning. The old bridge, unseen from here but not forgotten, groaned beneath the weight of the surging river. The storm had turned its constant murmur into a bellow. Inside, the baby's cries rose louder, desperate, a plea of confusion in a world suddenly fractured by sound and force. The shepherd turned, leapt to the crib, and pressed his muzzle against the child's face. The contact warm fur against wet cheeks steadied the baby for a breath, though tears still pooled in fragile eyes. The dog whined, low and soft, a lullaby born from instinct. But the storm gave no pause. A crack of lightning lit the room in pale blue, shadows leaping across walls. A moment later, the ground itself seemed to tremble, as thunder collapsed overhead. The baby wailed, the shepherd barked, the sound sharp, defiant. In that instant, the two voices became one, fear and protection woven together, each answering the other. The house shuddered again. Beneath the floorboards came the muffled groan of shifting ground, as though the river's hunger was reaching up through the soil. The shepherd froze, head low, ears pinned forward. He knew the sound of danger, the smell of earth broken open. Instinct clawed at him. Move, protect. He circled the crib, nails scraping against wood, searching for threat. His eyes locked on the door, rattling in its frame. The storm was not outside anymore. It was here, pressing against the walls, hunting for weakness. The baby reached out again, small hand trembling in the air. The shepherd returned, leaning his weight against the crib, until the child could clutch at his fur. The baby's fingers closed tightly, knuckles white, grip unyielding despite fear. The dog lowered his head and stayed still, anchoring the child with his presence. Then the break came, a sound like bones splitting through skin, ripped across the valley, the old bridge snapping under pressure. The river, swollen beyond memory, tore through wood and stone in a single violent surge. The vibration thundered through the ground, shaking the house to its frame. A window shattered. Cold air and rain crashed in, drenching floorboards, scattering glass like teeth across the ground. The shepherd lunged, positioning himself between crib and window, fur bristling, teeth bared at nothing but storm. The baby screamed, voice hoarse, chest heaving with sobs. The river had swallowed the bridge whole, and now its force clawed at the village itself. Outside, voices rose in panic, neighbors calling, feet pounding through water. Somewhere, a bell clanged, muffled by rain. But inside this room, there was only the baby and the shepherd. The world could break itself apart, piece by piece, and still the dog's body would remain fixed, immovable, shielding the fragile life behind him. The storm had come to test them. The bond, silent until now, had its first trial, and the shepherd knew this was only the beginning. The water did not hesitate. After the bridge's collapse, it roared forward, hungry, carrying branches, stones, and the remains of what had been the only crossing point. The river, swollen beyond its banks, tore toward the village, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Inside the house, the German shepherd's muscles quivered with alert tension. He moved back and forth, circling the crib, like a soldier under siege. Every sound, every creak of timber, every groan of the foundation, demanded his full attention. The baby clutched a blanket, soaked by the rain, now dripping steadily from the shattered window. Sobs quieter, but breaths uneven, shallow with fear. The shepherd nosed at the crib, then pawed the ground, restless, insistent. The house was no longer safe. He knew it with the certainty of instinct. The walls would not stand against the river's fury. Another crash shook the ground, deeper, closer. A door slammed somewhere in the village. Voices shouted orders drowned by rain. The shepherd barked once, sharp, then turned back to the crib. His gaze locked onto the baby. The decision had already been made. They could not remain here. With a leap, the dog pressed his front paws onto the crib's edge and gripped the blanket in his teeth. The baby squirmed, startled by the sudden jolt, but the shepherd held firm, tugging, pulling. The crib scraped against the wood floor, protesting in shrill squeals. Too slow, the river would not wait. Abandoning the crib, the shepherd pushed forward with urgency. His teeth fastened around the blanket, wrapping the baby. With a careful but powerful pull, he lifted the child. The baby's weight was awkward, limbs flailing, but the shepherd adjusted, finding balance. The child's cry cut through the thunder as he was carried, But the dog did not falter, his body bent against the burden, every muscle straining, yet his movement was sure. The doorway loomed ahead. Rain forced itself inside, carried on wind that smelled of wet earth and splintered wood. The shepherd pushed forward, claws scraping against the floor, dragging both himself and the baby toward the exit. Behind them, the house groaned, a sound of surrender. When the shepherd burst into the open, the world was chaos. Sheets of rain blurred the outlines of neighbors rushing to higher ground, their lanterns smothered by wind. The river churned like a living beast, swallowing fences, barns and carts with each. The baby's cries blended with the roar of water, but the shepherd pressed onward, muscles burning, paws sinking into mud with each step. He adjusted his grip constantly, ensuring the child's face stayed clear, breath unbroken. His eyes searched for elevation, for safety, for ground that would hold. A voice called out, a villager shouting his name, hand extended, in shock at the sight of the dog carrying the baby. But the shepherd did not slow. Words meant nothing. Survival meant everything. He bolted past them, heading toward the ridge beyond the square, the only high ground that would withstand the river's reach. The path was treacherous, slick stone and collapsing earth, but each step was driven by the same truth. The baby must live. Every instinct in the shepherd's body screamed in rhythm with the storm. Run, protect, endure. The baby's tiny hand, still clutching the blanket, brushed against his neck, a fragile weight reminding him why he could not fail. Behind them, the house surrendered at last. The sound of timber splitting and walls caving echoed through the storm. The shepherd did not turn. There was no past left to save, only forward, only safety, only life. The pursuit had begun, and it would not end until the baby was secure in a world where the river could no longer reach. The ridge loomed like a promise in the storm, but between it and the shepherd stretched a battlefield of water, debris and collapsing ground. The rain no longer fell. It hurled itself sideways, needles against fur and skin. The German shepherd's jaw tightened on the baby's blanket, teeth locked with a precision born of desperation. The child whimpered, eyes squeezed shut, but breath still came, ragged, terrified, alive. Each step forward was a battle. Mud pulled at the shepherd's paws, sucking him down, threatening to hold him long enough for the current to reach. He fought free, body jerking with force, claws scraping stone as leverage. Branches, broken fences, and shattered beams rushed past, each one a weapon waiting to strike. The shepherd twisted, dodged, lowered his head to shield the child from sharp edges. Pain lanced through his shoulder as wood grazed him, splitting skin. He did not stop. Ahead, shapes moved through the haze, villagers scrambling toward the ridge, lanterns bobbing like frail stars in the storm. One man turned, eyes widening at the sight of the shepherd hauling the baby. His voice cracked through the thunder, desperate, commanding, "Here, this way, bring him here." The dog's ears flicked at the call, but his pace did not falter. He pushed harder, chest heaving, vision tunneling on that higher ground. He would not yield the baby to the flood. Not now, not ever. The climb began. The slope was slick, rain carving rivulets that turned soil to sludge. The shepherd lunged upward, paws slipping, sliding back inches for every foot gained. The baby cried again, sound muffled against his wet fur. The shepherd planted himself, adjusted, found a rhythm. Dig, push, pull. His muscles screamed, lungs burning, but the ridge grew closer, stone offering more grip than earth. A hand appeared above, rough and calloused, reaching down. The shepherd snarled, not in malice but in warning. His body pressed tighter against the child. No one would take him, unless the shepherd willed it. The villager froze, then lowered his tone, voice steady despite the storm. "Easy, boy, easy. We'll help. Let him breathe." The shepherd hesitated, rain dripping from his muzzle, eyes locked on the strange. The baby coughed, choking on wet air. That sound broke the pause. With a shudder, the dog allowed the man's hands to close around the child. Careful, slow. The blanket slid from the shepherd's jaws as the villager lifted the baby to his chest. For a moment, the world narrowed to silence. The baby gasped, coughed, then wailed with renewed strength. Relief surged through the group. A collective exhale. The shepherd, trembling with exhaustion, collapsed onto his haunches. His body shook, fur clumped with mud and rain, chest heaving with each breath. But his eyes never left the child, now cradled in human arms. The villagers crowded closer, shielding them from wind with their bodies. One woman wrapped a dry shawl around the baby, whispering reassurances. Drowned by the storm, the man who had taken him turned back toward the shepherd, hand hovering in gratitude, uncertain if touch would be allowed. "You saved him," he said, voice rough. "Without you, he'd be gone." The shepherd's ears twitched, but his gaze stayed on the baby. Even as his body trembled, even as blood trickled from the cut in his shoulder, he leaned forward, muzzle brushing against the child's tiny hand once more. The baby, soothed despite the chaos, reached out weakly, fingers curling around wet fur. That touch anchored them both. Relief was not the end. It was a pause, a fragile breath before the storm demanded more. But in that fleeting moment, amid ruin and rain, the bond between them had proven unbreakable. The ridge held them safe. For now, the shepherd would not rest, not while danger still prowled the valley below. The ridge was not a sanctuary of comfort, only survival. The villagers huddled together beneath tarps and broken roofs, carried hastily from their ruined homes. Fire would not take in the rain, so warmth came only from pressed shoulders and sheer wind. Children clung to their mothers, elders whispered prayers, and men stared into the black distance, where the river had swallowed everything they had known. The German shepherd lay apart from them, body stretched low, sides heaving with exhaustion. His fur was matted, streaked with blood and mud. Every joint throbbed from the climb, but his eyes never closed. They remained fixed on the baby wrapped in a shawl at the center of the group. The child slept now, chest rising in soft rhythm, face pale but alive. The shepherd listened to each breath as though the sound itself bound him to existence. A woman approached, her steps cautious on the wet stone. She carried a basin of water, clear despite the storm, and set it gently beside the dog. "You're bleeding," she said, voice low but firm. The shepherd turned his head, teeth flashing in warning. She froze, hands open, eyes steady. "I won't take him. Only this." She nudged the basin closer with the toe of her boot. The dog sniffed at the water, lips trembling, then lowered his head to drink. The cool relief washed through his throat, steadied the pounding of his chest. The woman exhaled quietly, and left him. Hours passed. The rain thinned to a drizzle, then stopped, leaving only mist that clung to skin and stone. The baby stirred again, waking with a weak cry. Instantly, the shepherd rose, despite the ache in his muscles. He padded forward until he was near enough to brush his nose against the baby's shawl. The child's fists clenched, eyes blinking at the unfamiliar light. Then recognition. The baby's cry softened, replaced by the faintest gurgle, a sound that carried trust more profound than words. The villagers watched this exchange with silence heavy as stone. They had seen dogs guard livestock, hunt, fight. They had seen loyalty to masters. But this was something beyond. The animal had carried the child through storm and ruin, teeth locked not to harm but to preserve. The bond between them was not accident. It was lifeline. In the days that followed, the ridge became both refuge and prison. The river had cut off roads, destroyed bridges, swallowed fields. Food was rationed, water gathered from what the storm had left. Fear pressed in on them like the mist that refused to lift. Yet, in that bleakness, the baby and the shepherd became the rhythm of hope. Each morning, the dog lay beside the child as he slept, muzzle rising and falling in time with tiny breaths. When the baby cried from hunger, the shepherd paced restlessly until someone answered. When strangers reached too close, he stiffened, a wall of muscle and teeth between fragile skin and uncertain hands. But it was not only protection, it was growth. The baby, once helpless and flailing, began to stretch his arms with intention, reaching not just for comfort, but for connection. His hands sought the dog's fur, gripping, releasing, learning. The shepherd endured every tug, lowering his head so the small fingers could explore. In those quiet moments, healing passed between them. Wounds unseen, fear unspoken, strength rebuilt. One evening, when the sky finally opened to reveal a sliver of sun, the villagers gathered at the ridge's edge to look down at what remained. Fields were gone, homes reduced to skeletons of wood and stone. The old bridge was nothing but jagged posts, protruding from the river. The sight broke them into silence. But behind them a sound rose, soft, unexpected. The baby laughed. It was small, fragile, but real. The shepherd lifted his head at once, ears pricked, and nudged the child's belly with his nose. Another laugh came, brighter, carrying through the hollow air. For a moment, grief loosened its hold on the villagers. They turned, watching the pair, dog and child, restored not to what they had been, but to what they were becoming. In that fragile laughter, in the steady watch of the shepherd's eyes, lay a truth none could deny. Survival was not only endurance, it was bond. Healing had begun, and with it came the slow, unyielding growth that no flood could wash away. Night returned heavier than before. Though the storm had passed, its memory clung to the ridge, like smoke after fire. The villagers lay restless, shifting on damp ground, their ears tuned to every creak of settling earth. Sleep did not come easily to any of them, least of all to the babe. The child woke often, crying out in sharp bursts that cut through the silence. His small body trembled with each sound, as if the thunder still rumbled in his bones. Each time, the German shepherd was there, rising from his post beside the fireless circle, pressing close until the baby's sobs softened. The dog's nose brushed the child's cheek, his body curving protectively. Yet the baby's sleep remained shallow, haunted by shadows he could not name. The villagers whispered of rebuilding, of what little might remain in the valley below, but their words carried cracks of fear. Every mention of the river silenced them. Some could not bear to look downhill. Others stared too long, transfixed, waiting for the water to rise again. The echo of loss clung to them all, shaping their movements, shortening their words. The shepherd carried those echoes in his body. At every gust of wind, he bristled. At every drip of rain from the ridge above, he growled low in his throat. When a branch cracked in the forest, he sprang to his feet, teeth bared, until only silence answered. The baby mirrored him, jerking awake at sounds, clinging tighter, eyes darting toward shadows. Their bond meant safety, but it also meant shared fear, passed like a current between them. One night, a noise shattered the uneasy calm. A landslide broke loose on the far slope, stones tumbling in a roar that mimicked the storm's violence. Villagers screamed, clutching one another, convinced the ridge itself was breaking. The shepherd leapt over the baby's sleeping place, standing over him with fur raised, teeth flashing in the dim moonlight. His bark was sharp, unrelenting, cutting through the human panic. The baby woke with a scream, arms flailing until they found the shepherd's neck. Only then did the barking stop, though the dog remained rigid, eyes glowing with defiance, at the dark slope. The villagers quieted, breaths ragged, and slowly the truth settled. It had been only a fall of stone, not the return of the river. But the damage was done. Fear had taken root deeper than before. In the days that followed, small changes revealed themselves. The baby no longer laughed easily. His giggles had become rare, fleeting. He startled at sudden movements, pressed his face against the shepherd's fur, for refuge. The dog, once restless and eager to scout, now stayed closer, shadowing every step, unwilling to leave the child's side, even for water. Their bond had not weakened. It had deepened, sharpened into something unyielding, but it carried the weight of constant vigilance. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, the villagers attempted to descend from the ridge to search for supplies. The shepherd watched them go, body tense, gaze flicking between their path and the baby cradled against a woman's chest. When she stood to follow the others, the dog growled, not savage, but firm. His body blocked her path. The woman froze, then sighed, lowering herself back to the ground. The villagers understood. The child would not leave the shepherd's watch. Even safety now was fragile, balanced on instinct and fear. Every creak of earth, every whisper of rain, carried with it the echo of what they had survived, and the warning of what might come again. The baby and the dog bore it most clearly, Two lives tied together, carrying not just love, but the memory of almost loss. The ridge had spared them, but peace had not returned. The shadows of fear lingered, waiting in silence for the next test. The ridge had begun to feel less like refuge, and more like exile. Days stretched without the comfort of fire. Nights brought only damp cold and silence punctuated by restless cries. Food grew scarcer. Hope thinned. It was during one of these nights that the first true shadow emerged. The moon sat veiled behind ragged clouds, its light broken and weak. The villagers slept in scattered clusters, their bodies curled against one another for warmth. Only the shepherd remained awake, lying close to the baby, his eyes reflecting the faint silver of the sky. A sound carried up from the trees below, low, deliberate, not the wild rush of storm or the careless tumble of stone. Footsteps, too measured to be the random chaos of nature. The shepherd stiffened, his ears pricked forward, nose twitching against the night air. He rose silently, each step careful, and positioned himself between the sound and the baby. The baby stirred, sensing the shift. A whimper slipped from his throat, soft but urgent. The shepherd lowered his head, brushing against the child with reassurance. But his gaze stayed fixed on the dark edge of the ridge. From the mist emerged movement. First one figure, then another. Men, strange, their shapes blurred in the half-light, but their intent carried clearly in the way they moved. Too quiet, too cautious, as if not to wake the sleeping camp. One clutched a lantern, dimmed to a flicker. Another carried something longer, a tool perhaps, or a weapon. The shepherd's growl rolled low and steady, vibrating through the ground. The baby tensed at the sound, clutching at his blanket, eyes opening to the dark. His cry began to rise, thin and frightened. The growl turned into a bark, sharp and thunderous, exploding across the ridge. The villagers jerked awake, startled, hearts racing. Lanterns flared to life, illuminating faces, confused and fearful. Then they saw the intruders. The men froze under the sudden light. Their eyes darted across the group, measuring, calculate. The one with the lantern raised a hand as though in greeting, but his smile did not reach his eyes. "We mean no harm," he called over the wind. His voice was slick, practiced. "We come looking for shelter as you have." No one answered. The villagers looked to one another, uncertain, their fear growing thicker than the mist. The shepherd advanced a step, teeth bared, body rigid with the promise of violence. The baby clung to him, sobbing now, but the dog did not move from his stand. The man lowered his lantern, revealing the edge of a blade at his belt. "It is a cruel thing to deny help to those in need," he said softly, though his tone was edged with threat. Before the villagers could respond, the shepherd lunged forward, barking with ferocity that shattered the night. His body was a wall between the strangers and the baby, each bark punctuated with snapping jaws that caught the lantern's glow. The men stepped back instinctively, one lifting his arm to shield himself. The baby's cries grew louder, piercing, echoing into the valley. The strangers hesitated, realizing the attention they had drawn not just from the villagers, but from every ear within reach of the ridge. Their element of surprise was gone. The man with the blade cursed under his breath. "Not worth it," he spat, turning on his heel. The others followed, disappearing back into the mist as quickly as they had come. Silence returned, but it was a silence frayed with fear. The villagers gathered close, voices hushed but urgent, debating whether to keep watch in shifts, whether to move further into the forest. Through it all, the shepherd remained where he stood, chest heaving, eyes locked on the darkness below. When at last he turned back, he found the baby still clutching his fur, cheeks wet with tears. The dog lowered himself, curling around the child until the tremors eased. The villagers whispered thanks, though none dared step too close. The ridge no longer held just the memory of the storm. It now carried the mark of something colder, the knowledge that in darkness, not only nature but men themselves could become predators. And so, the bond of baby and dog tightened further, love now sharpened by vigilance, by the shadow of threats that wore many faces. Morning came muted, the mist refusing to lift from the ridge. Dew clung to every surface, turning branches into glass and soil into slick clay. The villagers rose in silence, the memory of the night still sharp. The intruders had left no trace but unease, and unease weighed heavier than hunger. The German shepherd did not rest. He had not closed his eyes fully since the storm, and after the encounter with the men, sleep no longer seemed possible. His body was weary, cut and bruised from the flood, yet his spirit pressed forward. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind, drew his attention. He patrolled the edge of the ridge as if it belonged to him alone, nose low, ears flicking. The baby watched him, wrapped in a patched blanket, cheeks pale, eyes wide. The child followed the dog's every move. His hands grasped at the air when the shepherd moved too far, small noises of protest bubbling up until the dog returned to his side. When the shepherd lay down, finally the baby reached forward, pressing fingers into his. The bond was no longer quiet. It had become dependence. Two lives braided tightly. The villagers noticed. At first they whispered of superstition, that perhaps the dog had been sent, that no ordinary animal could act with such devotion. But soon their whispers shifted. They began to trust him. When the shepherd barked, they paused to listen. When he stiffened, they looked toward the shadows. Slowly, his vigilance became theirs. One evening, as the sun bled red through the mist, a woman carrying water stumbled near the ridge's edge. The soil gave way under her weight, and her cry tore the air. Before any villager moved, the shepherd was there, charging, jaws fastening on the edge of her shawl. His weight countered her fall, claws digging into mud, body straining. Men rushed to help, pulling her back onto solid ground. When it was over, she sobbed in gratitude, reaching toward the shepherd. He stepped back wary, but his eyes never left her face. He had not saved her for thanks. He had acted because danger was his enemy, no matter its form. That night, the villagers voted quietly, without ceremony. The dog would be their sentinel, not just for the baby, but for all of them. Yet they understood, even if he watched over the ridge, his true loyalty remained with the child. The baby grew restless with the night. Each time fear stirred him awake, the shepherd was there, muzzle pressed close, heartbeat steady against small hands. Over time, the baby's cries softened, replaced by coos and murmurs. The dog's presence taught him calm, even in darkness. Protection was not only bark and bite, it was patience, presence, the quiet rhythm of breath shared in silence. But vigilance carried cost. The shepherd grew thinner, his ribs sharper beneath his fur. He ate only after the child had been fed, refusing scraps until the baby's need was met. His paws cracked from stone and cold. His wounds healed slow, yet no force could bend him from his post. The villagers, once wary, began leaving food for him first. Small offerings, scraps of bread, bits of dried meat, placed carefully at the edge of the camp. It was their silent recognition of his labor, their way of weaving him into their circle. Still, he remained apart, choosing the space beside the baby over the fire, the watchtower over the company of men. One night, when the moon hung low and pale, the ridge stirred again. A noise, soft, deliberate, rose from the forest. The shepherd's head snapped up. His growl rumbled like distant thunder. The villagers tensed, waiting. Nothing emerged. The night returned to silence. But the message was clear. Shadows would not stay away. Danger was patient, circling, waiting for weakness. The shepherd lowered his head once more. The baby's hand tangled in his fur, and closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to draw strength. He was their guardian now, and as long as breath remained in him, no shadow would reach the child. The ridge had kept them alive, but it could not keep them whole. With each passing day, tension thickened between the villagers. Hunger gnawed at their patience. Fear twisted into suspicion. What the river had spared. The silence threatened to unravel. By now the German shepherd was more than animal to them. He was omen, sentinel, judge. Some whispered reverence when he barked, treating his instincts as warning from the divine. Others muttered that too much faith was being placed in a beast, that his loyalty to the baby outweighed loyalty to the group. Neither side spoke loudly, but the fracture deepened in every word left unspoken. The baby had grown quiet. His cries no longer filled the night as they once had, but his silence was not peace. It was watchfulness. He clung to the shepherd's fur even in sleep, eyes opening at the faintest shift of tone in the villagers' voices. He did not yet understand words, but he understood tension, and he mirrored it. One evening, when the villagers gathered to divide what little food remained, the storm within them broke. A man argued that the baby should be given less. A mouth that small does not need as much. We all suffer for the sake of one child and one dog. His words carried hunger, but also resentment. The shepherd rose at once. He placed himself between the man and the baby, body low, teeth bared in silent warning. The air froze. The villagers stiffened, uncertain whether to defend or withdraw. The man's eyes burned with defiance, yet he did not step forward. The dog's growl was enough to end the debate. Food was placed before the baby, as always. That night, whispers grew sharper. Some said the dog had turned tyrant, dictating who lived and who starved. Others defended him. Without his vigilance, the intruders would have returned. Or worse, the camp split in thought, if not yet in action. The baby sensed it most of all. His restlessness deepened. He whimpered in his sleep, clutching tighter to the shepherd until his tiny fists whitened. The dog, too, carried the weight. His eyes stayed open longer. His patrols stretched further. He no longer trusted the ridge to hold peace, not just against what lurked in the forest, but against those within the circle. And then came the spark. During a gray morning, when mist still clung to the valley, the same man who had spoken against the child reached for the baby's shawl, muttering that he only wanted to keep him warm. The shepherd reacted instantly. His jaws snapped inches from the man's hand, the sound loud as thunder. The man stumbled back, cursing, his fear masked as outrage. "You see," he spat to the others. "It guards him like treasure. What happens when it decides one of us is threat? What happens when hunger makes us desperate?" No one answered. Some looked away. Others lowered their heads in shame. But the divide widened. The shepherd remained at his post, eyes unblinking, ears pinned forward, every muscle ready to strike if need came. The baby reached for him then, soft fingers brushing against his neck. The touch steadied the dog, easing the quiver in his stance. Together they held the silence, their bond a barrier against the storm now raging inside the humans around them. The ridge was no longer threatened only by river or shadow. It was threatened by its own people, hearts splintering, fear sharpening into doubt. And in that crucible, the baby and the shepherd became more than lifeline to each other. They became the fragile thread holding the entire camp from collapse. The ridge could not hold them forever. Food was nearly gone. Water collected from the last rainfall dwindled to a few skins. Hunger stripped civility, turning voices sharp and eyes suspicious. The fracture among the villagers widened each day, splitting them into factions. Those who trusted the shepherd and baby as their hope, and those who resented them as burdens. The German shepherd felt he no longer paced only the perimeter. He watched the villagers themselves. Every gesture weighed for threat. His ears flicked at raised tones. His body bristled at lingering stares. The baby clung to him, small fingers buried in his fur, sensing the unrest he could not name. Together, they became the still point in a storm that no longer belonged to nature but to men. Then danger came, not from within, but from the valley below. The river, swollen still from days of rain, had not receded as instead it pressed harder against its banks, devouring ground inch by inch. That morning, as mist curled up the slope, the earth shuddered with the crack of stone giving way. A section of the ridge groaned, split,
and slid downward, carrying trees and soil into the villagers screamed, scattering from the edge. The ground trembled beneath them, warning of more collapse. The shepherd reacted before thought. He gripped the baby's blanket in his teeth and pulled, dragging the child away from the breaking earth. The baby cried out, startled, but the sound was drowned in the roar of shifting land. Cracks spidered through the ground, splitting the ridge into unstable islands. The villagers shouted over one another, "Run, climb higher, leave the weak behind." A man seized the shepherd's path, reaching for the baby. His intentions, whether rescue or theft, were unclear, but the shepherd did not hesitate. He snapped at the man's hand, forcing him back, then pushed forward into the chaos. His muscles strained, claws digging into crumbling soil as he searched for solid ground. Behind them, the ridge gave way with a thunderous crash. The baby shrieked, clutching at the dog's neck, tiny fists gripping. The shepherd pressed onward, each leap carrying them away from the crumbling edge. Villagers scrambled in all directions, some toward the forest, some higher up the slope. The air filled with dust and screams, the sound of lives breaking apart once more. The shepherd's path narrowed to a ledge, no wider than his body. One misstep would send them both into the torrent below. His paws slid, claws scraping rock, but his grip on the baby never faltered. Inch by inch, breath by breath, he moved forward, body quivering with effort. A boulder crashed nearby, spraying shards of stone. The baby wailed, burying his face in the shepherd's neck. The dog lowered his body, shielding the child, then pushed forward again. At last, the ledge widened into firmer ground. The shepherd lunged onto it, chest heaving, legs trembling. Above, a group of villagers had reached safer height. They called out, their voices carrying fragments through the roar. "This way. Hurry." One man stretched down his arm, hand outstretched. The shepherd paused, eyes fixed on the gesture. His body remained coiled, ready to defend if betrayal lurked. But the baby's cries spurred him. He climbed, claws gouging earth, body dragging upward. At the final stretch, he leapt, landing against the man's chest. Together they stumbled, collapsing onto solid ground. The baby slid into the villager's arms, for only a heartbeat, before the shepherd reclaimed him, pressing close, teeth flashing in warning. The villager raised his hands, backing away. The bond was inviolate.
When the earth stilled, the survivors gathered. Half their number was gone, swallowed by the collapse. Faces streaked with mud and fear turned to the shepherd and child. Once again, it was they who had escaped the jaws of the storm. They who had shown the path to survival, but there was no relief. Only the grim knowledge that safety was temporary. The ridge was broken, the river still rising, shadows still circling. The escape had been narrow, too narrow, and it left no illusions. For the baby and the shepherd, there could be no rest. Their lifeline had carried them through collapse, but greater trials waited beyond. The ridge no longer felt like ground. It had become a fragment, a scar jutting above the devouring river. Where once fields had spread wide and homes had anchored families, there was now only a shifting expanse of mud, stone, and water. The survivors sat in silence, too few, too hollow-eyed to speak of rebuilding. The baby whimpered softly, his voice thin, nearly swallowed by the wind. The German shepherd lay curled around him, body a wall against cold air. His fur was stiff with dried mud, ribs sharp beneath skin, but he held fast. Each shallow breath from the child was counted. A dog's ears flicked at every sound. The drip of water, the creak of settling earth, as though listening not only for danger but for life itself. The villagers avoided their eyes. They had begun to see the pair as something separate, untouchable. It was not resentment anymore. It was awe laced with fear. The shepherd had dragged the baby through flood, storm, collapse, even the greed of men. No ordinary animal could endure so much, and yet he did. Without pause, without question. Some muttered that the dog's will was unnatural. Others whispered it was love, made flesh. The shepherd did not care for their whispers. His world was narrowed to the rhythm of the baby's chest, the warmth of small hands tangled in his fur. He licked the child's cheek when it grew pale, nudged him upright when his breaths faltered, pressed closer when the wind cut sharper. The bond had become more than instinct. It was survival made deliberate, an oath renewed with every heartbeat. But survival was brittle. Food had dwindled to scraps, roots dug from wet soil, a handful of dried meat passed around with trembling hands. The shepherd refused to eat unless the baby's needs were met first. Hunger carved deeper into his frame, but his vigilance did not falter. His body weakened, yet his eyes burned brighter, as if love itself kept him standing. One night, the baby's cry broke differently. Not the sharp pitch of fear, but the hollow rasp of weakness. His small chest shuddered with each inhale, his body trembling with fever. Panic rippled through the survivors, but none moved forward. Only the shepherd acted, pressing his muzzle against the baby's forehead, then looking sharply at the villagers, a growl vibrating low in his chest. It was not threat, it was At last, a woman approached, carrying the last of the herbs salvaged from a flooded home. She boiled them in a dented pot over a faint flame coaxed from dry moss. The bitter brew was pressed to the baby's lips. He drank weakly, half spilling, but some drops passed down his throat. The shepherd hovered, pacing, nudging the child's chin upward to force each swallow. His eyes never left him, as though willing strength back into fragile flesh. Through the long night, the baby's breathing steadied. Each rise and fall of his chest was a victory. The shepherd licked the sweat from his brow, keeping vigil until dawn bled gray across the broken sky. When the baby finally slept deeper, without the rasp of fever, the dog rested his head at last, exhaling in relief. The villagers watched, wordless. Between the child's frailty and the dog's unwavering devotion, something shifted. For the first time since the flood, a sliver of hope threaded through despair, not born of plans or strength of numbers, but of this bond. If such love could endure storm, hunger, collapse, and sickness, perhaps survival was still possible. Between each breath, they saw not only fragility, but defiance. And between that defiance, they began to glimpse a future. The baby stirred, reaching out even in sleep, hand finding the shepherd's ear. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the ground. Between breath and hope, they endured. The air had grown thin on the ridge. Hunger carved the survivors into shadows, their faces drawn, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. What little food remained was gone. The villagers began speaking less, saving their strength for the simple act of enduring. Hope flickered faintly, but each day felt like a countdown. The German shepherd's ribs showed sharply now, his fur dull from lack of nourishment. Still, his eyes burned with vigilance. He lay pressed against the baby, who had grown weaker but still clung to him with a grip that defied frailty. Their bond had become the last living fire in a camp that was otherwise cold. One evening, the villagers gathered in whispers, their voices sharp, urgent. Though the shepherd could not understand their words, he understood their tone. They spoke of survival, of desperate measures, of what could be spared and what could not. Some glanced at the dog and child, their eyes heavy with meaning. That night, the shepherd did not sleep. He circled the camp, hackles raised, growls rumbling low. He knew the threat was no longer from storm or river, but from hunger twisting men into predators. His body weakened, but his will sharpened. He would give everything before allowing harm near the child. The test came with the dawn. A man, eyes hollow, hands shaking, moved toward the baby. He carried a stick sharpened to a crude point, his face blank with desperation. His intention was clear. If food could not be found, then mouths had to be lessened. He reached out, voice trembling with something between apology and madness. The shepherd launched before the words could form. His body collided with the man's chest, jaws snapping, forcing the weapon to fall. The man cried out, tumbling back, blood springing from a shallow bite to his arm. Panic surged among the villagers, shouts and cries ringing through the camp. Some moved to restrain the dog, others to shield the man. The shepherd planted himself over the baby, teeth bared, eyes wild with fury. His growl shook the air. He was ready to tear through anyone who came closer, even if it meant his own life. But then the baby stirred. His small hand rose weakly, brushing against the shepherd's neck. The touch stilled the dog, anchored him in the storm of fear and anger. His growl softened to a whine, body trembling between instinct to kill and need to protect. The villagers froze at the sight. A man had drawn blood, yet the baby's touch alone had pulled the beast back from violence. What had nearly shattered into chaos instead settled into a fragile silence. The man who had attacked slumped to the ground, sobbing in shame. Others dragged him away, muttering about hunger and madness. The shepherd collapsed beside the child, pressing close, sides heaved. His body shook not from fear, but from the strain of carrying his duty to the edge. He had nearly given all of himself, nearly crossed the line that separated guardian from killer. The cost of protection had never been clearer. The baby curled against him, breathing soft but steady. Even in weakness, he gave the dog strength. And in that embrace the shepherd understood. Sacrifice might be demanded of him yet, not in blood spilled, but in life given. On the edge of sacrifice, the bond held firm. The dog would give everything, and the baby, fragile yet unyielding, was proof that love could demand nothing less. The ridge was no longer safe. Hunger had already split the villagers, but now nature returned to finish what the river had begun. It began with smoke, at first only a thin ribbon, winding through the morning mist, faint but acrid, clinging to the back of the throat. Then came the smell, sharp, choking, unmistakable. Fire, somewhere in the forest below. Flames had taken hold, feeding on dry timber left behind by the storm. The villagers panicked. Some shouted to flee higher. Others argued the fire would never reach this far. But the wind told another story. Gusts carried sparks uphill, scattering them across the ridge. A branch ignited, then another. Within moments, the mist glowed with a sinister orange pulse. The German shepherd sensed it before the rest. The shift of air, the crackle beneath the roar. He rose from his post beside the baby, fur bristling, nose tilted to the wind. His growl was not of threat but of urgency. The baby stirred, coughing at the smoke, his small fists clutching at the dog's fur, as if already aware their sanctuary was collapsing. The fire moved fast. Where water had been relentless, fire was merciless. Flames licked up the slope, devouring everything in their path. Villagers scrambled, grabbing what little they owned, stumbling through ash and heat, their cries mixed with the roar of burning trees, the world around them becoming a furnace. The shepherd made his choice. He gripped the baby's blanket between his teeth and pulled, lifting the child onto his back. The baby clung instinctively, coughing, eyes wide in terror. The dog lunged forward, weaving through the chaos, his body low to shield the child from falling embers. Sparks seared his fur, pain biting into his skin, but he pressed onward. Flames closed around them, walls of fire narrowing the paths. Heat pressed like a weight, suffocating, blinding. The shepherd's lungs burned with each breath, but he kept moving, every step driven by instinct. Protect, survive, endure. A tree collapsed ahead, its trunk split by flame, blocking the only clear route. Villagers screamed, scattering. The shepherd did not stop. He veered sharply, plunging into a narrow gap between burning roots. His body scraped stone, smoke choked his throat, but the baby stayed clutched to him, safe from the worst of the fire. On the far side, the path opened, scarred, unstable, but free of flame. The shepherd stumbled onto it, legs shaking, chest heaving. Behind them, the ridge was swallowed whole, orange light devouring the last of their refuge. The baby cried weakly, tears cutting clean tracks through soot on his face. The shepherd lowered himself, allowing the child to breathe easier, pressing his muzzle against the boy's cheek. Despite the smoke, despite the flames, the baby's hand reached forward, finding his ear, gripping tight. Even in terror, the bond remained unbroken. Other survivors stumbled out behind them, coughing, burned but alive. They collapsed on the charred ground, staring back at the inferno that had claimed their shelter. Nothing remained of the ridge, but fire and the villagers whispered of despair, of curses, of being driven by water and now by flame. But in their midst, one truth held steady. The baby lived, the dog lived. Together they had crossed through storm, collapse, hunger, and now fire itself. Their survival was no accident. It was bond forged in trial, a lifeline stronger than destruction. The shepherd lay beside the baby, his fur singed, his body trembling from exhaustion.
Yet his eyes burned still, not with fear, but with defiance. Fire could not sever what river had failed to drown. Through the fire, they had emerged, scarred, weakened, but together, the fire had left nothing but ruin. Blackened earth, stretched across the ridge, trees reduced to skeletal silhouettes clawing at the sky. Ash hung in the air like a second storm, coating skin and fur, stinging lungs with every breath. The survivors huddled together, too few now to form a crowd, their eyes hollow from hunger, smoke, and loss. The baby coughed in shallow bursts, his chest heaving with the effort. His face was pale beneath the soot, lips dry, eyes dull with fatigue. The German shepherd lay against him, ribs pressing through scorched fur, body trembling with weakness. Yet his eyes never closed. Each cough from the child jolted him upright, muzzle brushing the baby's cheek, as if sheer presence could will him to survive. The villagers whispered of leaving. The ridge was no longer livable. The land itself had turned against them. Somewhere beyond the valley, there must be safety, food, water. But between them and that promise, stretched wasteland, burned forest, rising river, unstable ground. To move was to risk death. To stay was to guarantee it. Arguments sparked, sharp and bitter. Some demanded they leave at dawn. Others refused, paralyzed by fear of the unknown. The divide deepened until voices rose to shouts. The shepherd growled low, placing himself between the baby and the noise, teeth bared, eyes locked on the men who had begun to shove one another. His warning silenced them more effectively than reason. That night, as smoke settled heavy over the camp, the baby's breathing worsened. His small body shivered, his cries weak and broken. The villagers looked on in pity, but none stepped forward. The shepherd, he nudged the baby upright, pressing his chest beneath the child's head, steadying his breathing with the rhythm of his own. His warmth became shield, his heartbeat a drum that called the baby back from the edge of silence. But the truth was clear. The child would not survive another night on the ridge, nor would the dog, his strength nearly gone. Survival lay only in movement, toward the distant highlands, where rumor said clean streams still flowed. At dawn, the trial began. The villagers set out in a broken line, stumbling across ash and stone. The shepherd carried the baby in his jaws by the blanket, then on his back when the ground grew too treacherous. Each step tore at his body, each breath scraped his throat raw, but he did not falter. The baby clung with small hands, eyes closed, trusting entirely in the dog beneath him. The path narrowed at the river's edge. The floodwaters had carved deep channels, swift and merciless. The only way forward was across a fallen tree, its trunk slick with ash and rain. One by one, the villagers crossed, trembling but determined. When it came time for the shepherd, the world seemed to still. He stepped onto the trunk, claws gripping bark. The river roared beneath, its current eager to drag them both into its depths. The baby whimpered, sensing the danger, his grip tightening. The shepherd paused only long enough to press his head against the child's cheek, a silent vow. Then he moved. Halfway across, the trunk shifted. A splintering crack echoed. The villagers screamed from the far bank. The shepherd froze, legs quivering, balance razor thin. For an instant it seemed certain they would fall, but then the dog lunged, muscles straining beyond their limits, carrying them in one desperate leap to solid ground. He landed hard, collapsing to his side, the baby tumbling into waiting arms. The villagers cheered, relief washing through them, but the shepherd lay still, sides heaving, eyes closed. Blood trickled from his paws, his breath shallow. The baby cried out, reaching for him, arms flailing. At the sound, the dog's eyes opened. With a shudder, he pushed himself upright, staggering toward the child. Their muzzles and hands met, touch binding them once more. The final trial had demanded everything, but love had carried them through. The villagers looked on, silent, humble. They understood at last. Survival had not come from numbers, nor from strength, but from the unbreakable bond of dog and child. Together, scarred and trembling, they continued toward the highlands, one step at a time. The highlands came slowly into view, rolling slopes washed clean by streams that glimmered in the morning light. After so many days of smoke, ash and ruin, the sight seemed unreal. Grass spread green across the hillsides, untouched by flood or fire. Trees rose tall and whole, their branches unscorched. The survivors halted at the edge of this new world, overcome by silence. For the first time since the storm, the air smelled of life instead of death. The German shepherd collapsed onto his haunches, chest heaving, eyes fixed not on the landscape, but on the baby in his care. The child stirred in his arms, cheeks still pale but breathing steadier now. He reached with one trembling hand and brushed the dog's muzzle. The shepherd leaned into the touch, closing his eyes, a deep exhale ruffling the baby's hair. The villagers spread out cautiously, testing the ground, cupping water in their hands, kneeling to gather berries and roots. Their voices were hushed, reverent. They no longer argued about who led or who had rights to what. Their survival had been stripped to its essence, and the truth was undeniable. They were alive because of what they had followed, the bond of child and dog that refused to end. The days that followed, they built shelter again. Branches were lashed into frames, covered with leaves patched with stone. Fires were coaxed to life, smoke curling skyward in signals of renewal rather than ruin. The shepherd kept his vigil, lying near the baby's resting place, ears twitching at every sound, though at last his body eased into longer sleep. For the first time since the flood, he allowed his guard to lower just enough to rest beside the child in peace. The baby grew strong, his cries turned from weakness into demands for food, his hands reaching not only to cling, but to explore. Laughter returned, soft at first, then fuller, echoing across the highlands, like a forgotten song. Each laugh drew the shepherd closer, his tail thumping weakly, eyes bright. When the child stumbled in his first steps across the grass, the dog was there, steadying him with his body, guiding him forward. The villagers watched in awe. They no longer saw just a dog and a baby. They saw a lifeline woven of instinct and love, of sacrifice and endurance. They spoke less of loss and more of rebuilding. Their children played again, their elders told stories at night, and their fear loosened with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the baby curled against the shepherd's side, fingers tangled in his. The dog lowered his head, resting his muzzle gently on the child's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Around them the camp was quiet, voices soft, the air warm with firelight, and the scent of grass. Peace had not come easy. It had been fought for, bled for, nearly lost to storm, hunger and flame. Yet here, on this high ground, it had been earned. The baby stirred, eyes fluttering open, and looked up at the shepherd. His lips curved into a small, weary smile. The dog's tail moved once, slow and deliberate, as if to say, "We made it." Together, they had crossed through every trial. Together, they had restored what the world had tried to take. Peace was no longer fragile, it was theirs. The highlands woke differently than the ridge had. Gone were the heavy clouds and the acrid smoke of fire. Instead, the dawn spilled across the valley in soft gold, the kind of light that lingers gently, touching grass and stone, as though blessing what had survived. The air smelled of earth after rain, not ruin but rebirth. Birds sang again, hesitant at first, then swelling into chorus as if the land itself had drawn a long breath after holding it too long. The villagers rose slowly, their bodies stiff, their eyes hollow from months of. They moved among the shelters they had built, rude structures of branches, bark, and stone. But now, under this new light, the huts seemed less like desperation, and more like foundation. The ground here was firm, water ran clear in streams, and roots and berries could be gathered without fear of ash or flood. For the first time, survival felt possible. At the heart of this fragile renewal was the baby. He sat propped against a woven mat, shawl draped across his shoulders, eyes blinking into the sunrise. His cheeks still held the pallor of hardship, but there was warmth in his face again, a softness that had been absent on the. His small hands clutched at the grass, tearing blades with clumsy determination, holding them as though they were treasure. Beside him, as always, lay the German shepherd. The dog's body bore the scars of their trials, burned fur, cuts turned to pale ridges, but his eyes glowed steady. He kept his muzzle low, resting it across his paws, yet every sound drew a flick of his ears. His gaze swept constantly between the child, the villagers and the tree line beyond.
The villagers had ceased to question his place. They no longer muttered about burdens, no longer whispered about hunger. Instead, they watched with quiet respect, as the dog shadowed the child's every move. Some even smiled faintly when the baby reached to tug at the shepherd's ear or clutched fistfuls of fur for balance. The bond had become more than survival. It had become symbol. That morning, the villagers gathered to decide their future. The flood and fire had stripped them of land and memory, but here, in the highlands, they could begin again. Voices rose, not in panic this time, but in determination. They spoke of clearing fields, of planting seeds salvaged from what little they carried, of raising structures stronger than temporary shelters. For the first time since the storm, the word future returned to their tongue. The shepherd remained apart from the circle, his body angled toward the baby, yet his ears tracked the voices. The baby, too, seemed drawn to the cadence of their speech, his small head tilting toward the sound. Though he could not yet understand, his world was bound to the rhythm of survival, and these words carried the shape of tomorrow. When the council ended, one elder approached the child and the dog. She lowered herself slowly, her hands trembling with age, and set a piece of bread, precious, hard-won, before the pair. The shepherd's eyes flicked to her hand, then to the baby. He did not move until the child reached forward, grasping clumsily at the offering. Only then did the dog lean in, tearing off a small piece, leaving the rest in the baby's lap. The elder smiled faintly. "You teach us more than we teach you," she whispered, not expecting reply. She rose and left them in peace. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist. The highlands stretched endless in every direction, green, wild, waiting. For the first time since the world had shattered, the horizon did not look like threat. It looked like possibility. And in the center of it sat a child and his guardian, bound not by chance, but by a love that had endured every trial. The grass on the highland slopes had grown tall, soft under bare feet. Morning dew clung to each blade, sparkling like fragments of glass under the early sun. The baby, stronger now, though still wobbly, pulled himself upright against the trunk of a fallen branch. His small legs trembled, muscles uncertain, but determination burned in his dark eyes. The German shepherd stood beside him, motionless, watching. His ears flicked with every sound in the field, birdsong, the distant rush of water, but his gaze never strayed far from the child. When the boy tottered forward, releasing the branch to take his first unsteady step, the dog shifted, steadying him with the weight of his shoulder. The baby laughed. The sound was sharp, bright, cutting through weeks of silence that had wrapped the survivors. Heads turned. Some villagers paused in their labor of clearing brush or hauling stones, startled at the sound. It had been so long since laughter felt natural that it seemed out of place here, like sunlight striking through storm clouds. But then the sound spread, warming faces, loosening shoulders. For that moment, survival was no longer their only task. Life itself was returning. The boy stumbled, fell against the shepherd's side, and giggled again. The dog lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against the child's cheek, a rumbling whine escaping his throat. Not frustration, encouragement. The baby pushed himself up again, gripping the dog's fur for balance. Together they moved across the grass, one step, then two, then collapse, then laughter again. The villagers gathered quietly, circling at a distance. No one dared interrupt. They watched as the boy's small world expanded, each step a triumph, each fall softened by the guardian, who never left his side. It was not just the child learning to walk, it was the entire camp remembering how to move forward. By midday, the baby managed half a dozen steps unaided, though always toward the shepherd. His arms stretched out, reaching for that steady form, trusting completely. The dog endured every pull, every tumble, never flinching, even when tiny fists gripped too tight. He was patience itself, the ground beneath the child's uncertainty. Later, when the sun dipped low, the villagers lit a fire. It was the first flame since the ridge, built carefully, tended reverently. Around it they gathered, sharing roots, berries, and the faint sweetness of boiled grain. The baby sat in the shepherd's lap of fur, chewing on a softened stalk, his eyes wide in firelight. Each crackle of wood drew his attention, but he did not startle. The shepherd had taught him that flame, like storm, was to be faced, not feared. Stories began that night. The elders spoke of floods past, of ancestors who had endured famine and fire. Their voices wove history into the smoke, reminding the survivors that they were not the first to rebuild. But always, their eyes returned to the dog and child, seated together at the fire's edge. Already their story had taken root in memory, joining the old tales with something new. When the baby drifted into sleep, head pillowed against the shepherd's chest, the villagers did not move him. They knew better. The dog's watch was more certain than any guard they could see. The flames hissed, sparks lifting into the night. Above, stars broke through, scattered across the sky in cold brilliance. The highlands stretched into darkness, vast and unknown, but the survivors felt no fear. They had seen first steps taken. They had heard laughter again. They had watched the bond of guardian and child weave itself into something unshakable. The horizon no longer loomed as a threat. It beckoned. The highlands offered safety, but safety did not erase memory. Each dawn that painted the grass gold also pulled shadows out of the past. The villagers spoke less now of immediate hunger or fear. They spoke of what had been lost. The flood had swallowed entire fields where wheat once bent under summer wind. The fire had devoured barns, homes, and tools carried through generations. In the evenings, around the fire, stories spilled like water, of a father whose cart had been swept away, of a mother whose orchard was now ash, of children who had not reached the ridge. Each word carried grief, heavy and unyielding. The German shepherd lay close to the circle, the baby tucked against him. The child listened without understanding, head tilted, as voices cracked with sorrow. Sometimes, when grief grew too sharp, the baby would laugh suddenly, a sound unshaped by tragedy. His laughter broke through silence, not cruel but innocent, like a reminder of what had survived. The shepherd would nuzzle him then, tail thumping once against the ground, anchoring the moment. For a breath, grief loosened its grip. Yet memory lingered in subtle ways. Some villagers refused to fetch water alone, afraid of the river's pull. Others startled at thunder, even distant, dropping their tools to clutch at one another. At night, dreams tore them awake, cries of fire or water, jolting the camp from uneasy sleep. The shepherd always rose first, scanning the darkness, growling low, until he was certain there was no threat. Only then would the camp settle. For the baby, memory took different form. He startled at sudden movement, clutching the shepherd's fur. Loud voices made him cry, though he quieted quickly once pressed against the dog's chest. His tiny body carried echoes he could not name, shadows of nights spent under storm and flame. Yet each day he grew stronger, steps surer, laughter full. His resilience became proof that the past, while heavy, need not break the future. One evening, the villagers asked the elders why the flood had come, why the fire had followed. Some spoke of punishment, others of fate. The shepherd, lying at the baby's feet, lifted his head at their words. His eyes reflected the firelight, steady, unblinking. It was not punishment or fate that had carried the child through. It was choice, sacrifice, bond. The villagers fell silent, glancing at the pair as though reminded of a truth deeper than any myth. The baby stirred then, toddling forward on uncertain legs. He carried a small stick, waving it with clumsy pride. The shepherd followed, close enough to catch him if he fell. The villagers watched as the boy presented the stick to an elder, dropping it at her feet with a The elder bent, tears rising unbidden. "He gives where we have lost," she whispered. "Perhaps we have not been abandoned after all." The camp grew quieter in the days after. Work continued, fields cleared, shelters strengthened, but voices soft. They no longer spoke only of what was gone, but of what had endured. The child and the dog were no longer reminders of loss. They had become reminders of survival. Still, memory lingered like smoke. Each villager carried it, silent and heavy. And yet, when despair pressed too close, they looked toward the shepherd and the baby. They saw not ruin, but bond. And in that bond, they found a weight lighter than grief, the weight of hope. The highlands, though safer than the ridge, were not free of danger. Beyond the cleared fields stretched forest and stone, wild country untouched by fire or flood. In its shadows lived creatures that had not fled, wolves lean from winter, boars driven closer by the loss of lowland forage. Hunger prowled the woods, as surely as it had stalked the survivor. The shepherd sensed it first. One night, as the villagers lay in uneasy sleep, he rose suddenly, nose lifted to the wind, his ears pinned forward, his body stiffened. A growl rumbled low in his chest, waking the baby at once. The child whimpered, clinging to his fur, but the dog pressed him back with his muzzle, urging him to stay low. Then he stepped into the dark. At the edge of the camp, eyes glowed between trees, yellow, unblinking, circling. Their silhouettes shifted in the mist, bodies lean, ribs sharp beneath fur. They did not rush, they measured. Hunger made them bold, patience made them deadly. The shepherd planted himself between the camp and the forest, tail stiff, chest forward. His bark shattered the silence, deep and commanding. Villagers jolted awake, scrambling to their feet, clutching torches and sticks. But it was the shepherd who held the line. His body was rigid, every hair bristling, every muscle taut with readiness. The wolves paced closer, teeth flashing in moonlight. One lunged forward, testing. The shepherd met it head on, jaws snapping, teeth clashing with a sound like breaking bone. The wolf yelped, retreating, blood bright against its gray muzzle. But the pack did not scatter. They circled wider, shadows closing. The villagers shouted, waving firebrands, but their fear weakened their grip. Some stumbled back toward the shelters, eyes wide. The shepherd did not move. He barked again, the sound tearing through the trees, defiance against the circle tightening around them. Then the largest wolf advanced, shoulders high, eyes locked on the baby crying behind the fire. It leapt forward with savage force. The shepherd met it midair. The two bodies collided, tumbling across the earth in a blur of fur and blood. Growls and snarls filled the night, jaws snapping, claws raking. The villagers shouted, but none dared intervene. The shepherd's teeth found the wolf's throat. He clamped down, body shaking with the force of his grip. The wolf thrashed, then stilled, its body falling limp. Silence broke across the clearing. The pack hesitated, eyes flicking between the fallen leader and the dog standing above it, blood dripping from his muzzle, chest heaving. The shepherd barked once, sharp and final. The wolves melted back into the forest, shadows dissolving into mist. The danger passed, but the camp was left trembling. The dog staggered, legs quivering, blood streaking his side where claws had torn him. Yet, he returned to the baby immediately, pressing his muzzle against the child's cheek. The baby reached out, small hands smearing red across fur, eyes wide with both fear and relief. The shepherd lowered himself to the ground, curling around the boy once more. The villagers gathered slowly, torches raised. They looked at the dog not with awe this time, but with reverence. He had not only guarded one child, he had held back death for them all. The trial had come, and he had endured, but the cost was heavy. His wounds ran deep, his body thin with hunger. The shepherd had proven his strength, but each battle left him closer to breaking. The villagers knew it, even if they did not speak it aloud. The baby knew it too, clinging tighter than before, as though sensing the weight pressing down on his guardian. The night quieted again. The wolves were gone, but their shadow remained. The shepherd had defended them, but the highlands had shown its truth. Danger never vanished. It waited, and every time it came, the bond between child and dog was tested at the edge of sacrifice. Seasons turned across the highland. What began as a scattering of shelters grew into a settlement, roofs thatched with reeds, fields carved from the hillside, paths pressed into soil by countless feet. Where ruin had once followed them, life now took root. The child grew with the from crawling to stumbling, from stumbling to running. He learned balance under the patient shadow of the shepherd. The dog followed him through every stage, nudging him away from sharp rocks, standing steady when small hands clutched at his fur, barking sharp warnings when danger prowled near the camp. By the time the boy's legs carried him without falter, the villagers had ceased to call him merely a survivor. They called him the child of the flood and fire, and the shepherd, the guardian, who would not yield. Their story was repeated at every fire, told to each new child born into the highland camp. It was not just survival they remembered, it was the bond that had carried them through. Yet time marked them differently. The boy grew taller, his laughter louder, his steps quick across the field. The shepherd slowed, his once lean body thickened with scar tissue, his gait stiffer from old wounds. White crept into his muzzle, his eyes clouded faintly with age. Still he did not leave the boy's side. Even when his pace faltered, his watch never. One autumn, when the leaves burned gold across the hills, the boy, now old enough to string words together, placed a hand on the shepherd's back and whispered, "Stay." It was his first true command. The dog obeyed not because of training, but because the bond was deeper than any word. When the boy ran ahead into the field, laughing, the shepherd followed at his slower pace, never losing sight of him. The villagers saw in this simple scene the arc of their own lives. They had been broken, scattered, nearly swallowed by the storm. Now they had fields that fed them,
fires that warmed them, laughter that returned to their nights, and at the center of it, still was the pair who had carried them all through ruin. As the shepherd aged, his legend grew. Children too young to remember the ridge sat wide-eyed at the fire, as elders told of the storm, the collapse, the fire, the wolves. Each story ended the same way, with the image of a dog carrying a baby through chaos, teeth clenched, eyes burning. The boy listening among them would lean against the shepherd, who dozed by the fire, ears flicking even in sleep. The boy grew into a child of questions, asking about rivers, about fire, about why storms came. The villagers answered carefully, but it was the shepherd who gave him the truest lessons: patience, vigilance, courage. The child learned to read the tilt of the dog's ears, the rumble of his growl, the stillness of his body when danger was near. These lessons shaped him more than words ever could. One winter, when the cold cut sharp, the shepherd fell ill. He lay curled in the boy's hut, breath shallow, eyes dim. The camp grew silent, as though holding breath with him. The boy stayed at his side, refusing food, refusing sleep, pressing his face into the dog's fur. When dawn broke, the shepherd stirred weakly, nudged the boy's cheek, and rose once more. His body trembled, but his will endured. The camp exhaled, relief spreading like warmth. The legend did not end yet. Years passed. The boy grew into youth, tall, strong, his voice steady. The shepherd aged into stiffness, his muzzle silver, his eyes dim but still sharp when fixed on the boy. They walked the highlands together, no longer in silence, but in companionship. Where once the dog had led and the boy followed, now the boy guided, hand resting on the shepherd's back. The villagers understood. This bond was more than survival, it was legacy. The boy would grow into a man who had been raised by love and guarded by sacrifice. And the shepherd, though his days dwindled, would live forever in the stories, in the strength of the child who had survived because of him. On the day the first stone was laid for a hall at the center of the settlement, the boy stood with his hand resting on the shepherd's back. His voice rang clear as he spoke to the villagers. We build because we survived, and we survived because love held us when nothing else would. The camp fell silent, then bowed their heads, not to stone, not to river or fire, but to the bond between dog and child. That night, beneath a sky bright with stars, the shepherd lay beside the boy, muzzle resting on his lap. His breath was slow, his body weary, but peace radiated from him. The boy stroked his fur, whispering stories back to him, the same tales the villagers told but softened, filled with laughter. The bond that had carried them through storm, fire, hunger, and fear had become something more enduring than survival. It had become the thread of their people's story, the proof that even in ruin, love could build anew. And so the chapter of flood and fire ended, not in despair but in peace, in legacy, in a bond that would outlast even time. The highlands had changed again. Fields once wild with grass now lay furrowed, green with crops that rose shoulder high by midsummer. Huts had become homes, stone walls braced with timber, smoke curling steady from hearth fire. Where ruin had once bound the survivors into silence, life had grown noisy again. Children shouting across fields, hammers striking wood, voices carrying plans for a tomorrow that no longer felt fragile. At the edge of this renewal ran the boy, no longer a bundle of blankets, no longer a tottering figure clutching at fur, but a child quick on his feet, arms outstretched like wings. His laughter carried across the hills, bright, unbroken, startling birds into flight. He ran with a freedom the ridge-born survivors could hardly imagine, a freedom bought in blood and sacrifice. The German shepherd followed, as he always had, but now his stride was slower, heavier. His once sleek body bore the weight of years. Scars traced his flanks like rivers, his coat flecked with gray, his breath heavier after each climb. Where once he had surged ahead, clearing danger before it reached the boy, now he lagged just behind, eyes fixed, careful to keep him always within reach. The boy noted. He paused at the crest of a hill, waiting, watching the shepherd climb. Come, he called, voice sharp but full of affection. The dog obeyed, pushing his body forward, paws steady despite the tremor in his legs. When at last he reached the top, the boy knelt, wrapping his arms around his neck. You're slow, he whispered, not as complaint but as truth. The shepherd pressed his muzzle into the boy's shoulder, closing his eyes. That night, at the fire, the villagers whispered of age. They had watched the dog defy storm, flood, fire, hunger, wolf. They had seen him rise bloodied, but unyielding, time and again, but no creature could outlast years. His gait told the story plainly now, and in the boy's eyes lingered the question. None dared speak. How long before the guardian's watch ended? The boy lay with him that night, curled against his side. His small hand rested on the shepherd's chest, rising and falling with each labored breath. He did not sleep easily. Dreams stirred him awake, dreams of rivers roaring, of fire crackling, of shadows moving in the forest. Each time he woke, he pressed closer, whispering into fur. Stay, the shepherd endured, eyes half closed, ears twitching at every sound. His body weakened, but his duty did not. Every cry from the boy, every whisper of fear, called him back from the edge of rest. He would stay, as long as breath allowed.
But the signs were there. Each dawn, the boy ran farther, and each dusk, the shepherd fell deeper into exhaustion. The villagers watched with reverence and sorrow, for they knew the fading light of his strength was not failure, it was inevitability. And in that inevitability lay the seed of the next trial. Not storm or fire, but the test of how love endures when even guardians must fall. The highland settlement had begun to look permanent. Fields spread wide with barley and beans. Stone paths wound between huts. Children played by the stream, their laughter unbroken by fear. For the first time since the flood and fire, the villagers believed they had more than survival. They had a future. But futures draw eyes. It was late in autumn when the first strangers appeared. 3 figures crested the ridge at dusk, silhouettes against the setting sun. They carried no banners, but their cloaks were trimmed in colors unfamiliar to the highland. One leaned heavily on a staff, another bore a bow across his back, and the third, broad-shouldered, scarred, walked with the assurance of someone used to command. The villagers gathered uneasily. They had seen too much ruin to welcome strangers lightly. Men gripped tools as weapons. Women pulled children back. The German shepherd was the first to act, old, stiff, but unrelenting. He moved forward, planting himself between the settlement and the intruders. His growl, low and steady, carried across the clearing. The boy followed, clutching the dog's fur, eyes wide with both fear and defiance. The strangers halted. The scarred man raised a hand, palm outward. "We come in peace," he called, his voice deep, carrying the confidence of one accustomed to being heard. "We have food to share. We seek trade, not war." The villagers murmured, torn between suspicion and hope. Food was precious, and the offer tempting. But the shepherd growled louder, his body rigid, teeth bared. He did not The boy clung tighter, whispering, "Stay," as though the command itself could anchor the dog's strength. The scarred man crouched slightly, lowering his voice. "Old one," he said, speaking directly to the dog, "we mean no harm. You've fought enough battles to know when an enemy stands before you. We are not that." But the shepherd did not relent. His eyes locked on theirs, unblinking. Reading every twitch, every shift of weight, he had learned too well that words could lie, but intent could not hide. The boy mirrored him, chin lifted, silent but unyielding. At last, the villagers intervened. The elder stepped forward, voice steady despite her age. "If you come to trade, you may share our fire. But your weapons stay outside the circle." Reluctantly, the strangers agreed, laying their bow and blades aside. Still, the shepherd did not relax. He remained planted at the boy's side, eyes never leaving the newcomers. When they sat at the fire, he circled, growling whenever one shifted too quickly. His presence made the meal tense, each bite of bread taken under the weight of his watch. That night, whispers spread through the camp. Some believed the outsiders were genuine, bringing chance of trade, tools, even alliance. Others muttered of hidden motives, of greed disguised as generosity. But all agreed on one point. The shepherd's distrust could not be ignored. He had never been wrong. The boy stayed awake long into the night, his hand resting on the dog's neck. He listened to the growl rumbling faintly in his guardian's chest, a sound that told him what words could not danger lingered. Maybe not in open threat, but in shadows yet to fall. By dawn, the strangers had shared their food and promises of return. They left with smiles and nods, but the shepherd tracked their retreat with narrowed eyes, his tail stiff, his body trembling with the effort of vigilance. The boy leaned into him, whispering, "I'll listen. I'll watch." The dog exhaled, pressing his muzzle into the child's shoulder. The highlands had survived storm and fire, but now a different trial loomed, one not born of nature's fury, but of men, and though the shepherd's body faded, his instinct blazed. He knew their peace was fragile, and strangers always carried teeth hidden behind their smile. The boy's questions sharpened as he grew. He no longer accepted vague comforts or half-truths. Around the evening fire, when the villagers' faces flickered in the orange glow, he asked again and again, why did the river rise so high? Why did the flames follow after? Why did so many not survive? The camp fell into silence each time. Some turned their faces toward the ground, others busying their hands with weaving or carving to avoid his gaze. To speak of the past was to reopen wounds, and most had spent years trying to scab them over. But the boy did not relent. He would ask the same the next night, and the next. Each question was sharper, more insistent, as though his very being depended on hearing the truth. The German shepherd remained beside him at every fire. Old now, his body bore the toll of years, but his eyes still burned with the weight of memory. He had carried the boy through storm and flame, stood against hunger and wolves, and now, though his voice could not form words, his presence itself was answer. At last, one evening, the elder spoke. Her voice cracked like the wood in the fire, low and raw. The water rose because we thought the river would never change. She said, we built too close, we trusted too easily, and when the storm came, it gave no mercy. The fire came after because the land was weakened, and what survived the flood fed the flames. Many were lost because we believed safety was ours by right. We were wrong. The boy listened, face still, eyes fixed on the flames. His hand rested on the shepherd's back, fingers tangled in fur. The dog leaned into him, as though to say, you were not wrong, you were unprepared. And why did we live when others didn't? The boy pressed. His voice did not shake, it was steady, demanding. The elder turned her gaze toward the shepherd. Because he would not let you die, she whispered. And because in saving you, he reminded all of us that love was stronger than fear. The villagers murmured, some nodding, some wiping tears. For years they had carried the burden of memory, as weight alone. Now in the boy's relentless questioning, it began to take shape as lesson. The boy looked down at his guardian. Then I will remember, he said simply. He bent low, pressing his forehead to the dog's. The shepherd closed his eyes, tail thumping once. Weak but from that night, memory no longer hid in silence. Around the fires, stories poured out, of families lost, of nights endured, of the long climb to the ridge. The grief was sharp, but the telling was healing. The boy listened to every word, absorbing them, as if they were his own path. The villagers saw themselves in him, a child who carried not just his life, but the memory of them all. The burden of memory had passed to the next generation. And though heavy, it did not crush him. It shaped him. The shepherd, lying at his feet, seemed to know. His body sagged with age, his breaths slower each night. But in his eyes there was a quiet peace. The boy no longer needed shielding from the truth. He was learning to carry it himself, and so the bond, once only of survival, deepened into legacy. Winter came sharp and early. The highlands, once green and generous, turned gray beneath frost. Crops failed faster than the villagers had expected. Stores dwindled. Hunger whispered again. It was in that lean season that danger returned. One night, when the fire burned low and the wind howled across the ridges, the dogs of the forest came. Not wolves this time, but feral strays, gaunt and wild-eyed, driven by the same hunger that gnawed at men. Their howls split the night, rising in chilling chorus. The villagers jolted awake, scrambling for torches, hearts pounding. The shepherd rose slowly, stiff limbs straining to obey. His body was older now, each step heavy, but his eyes sharpened with the memory of duty. The boy clung to him at first, whispering, "Stay with me," but the shepherd shook him off gently, nudging him toward the huts. This was not a fight for a child, this was his fight. The strays broke from the trees, shadows with teeth. They darted at the perimeter, testing the circle of firelight. The villagers waved sticks, shouted, but fear made their arms weak. The shepherd did not wait. He lunged forward, a growl erupting from his chest, deeper than his frail body should have been able to summon. The first stray met him head on. Jaws clashed, fur flew. The shepherd's teeth found the intruder's throat and tore, forcing it back with a cry. The others circled, snapping, lunging. He met each with ferocity, his body a wall, his spirit refusing to yield. The boy screamed from the hut, straining against arms that held him back. "No, don't, please." But the shepherd did not turn. His world narrowed to teeth and survival, as it had so many times before. The fight raged. Blood streaked the snow. The shepherd staggered, a gash across his flank, but when one stray slipped past, aiming for the huts, he summoned strength from marrow. He hurled himself forward, intercepting, forcing it down with sheer will. The pack faltered. They had come seeking weakness but met unbreakable defiance. At last, with snarls of frustration, they fled into the dark. The clearing was silent, but for the ragged sound of the shepherd's breath. He stood swaying, body torn, eyes dim, but still he turned back toward the huts, toward the boy. The villagers released him, and the child ran into the open, bare feet, striking cold earth. He threw himself against the shepherd, arms wrapping his neck. "Stay," he sobbed. "Please stay." The dog lowered his head, pressing his muzzle into the boy's shoulder. His tail thumped once against the snow. His body shook, but his eyes shone steady, fixed only on the child. The villagers gathered around them silent. They had seen courage before, but this was sacrifice. The shepherd had defended them all, but it was clear to every eye, he had fought for the boy first, last, always. The last stand had come, and though the shepherd's body was failing, his love had burned so fierce it drove death itself back into the tree. The battle left silence heavier than snow. The strays had fled, but their presence lingered in blood and breath. The German shepherd stood only long enough to guide the boy back toward the huts, each step slower, body swaying beneath invisible. Once inside the circle of firelight, he collapsed. The boy dropped to his knees, arms wrapping the great head, sobs breaking raw from his chest. "Stay," he whispered again and again, as if the word itself could bind life. The dog's eyes half closed, but they did not waver. They stayed fixed on the boy, even as his breaths grew shallow. The villagers gathered in a ring, heads bowed. They had no words. They knew what they were witnessing. The guardian who had carried them all through storm, flood, fire and hunger, was giving his last breath in the same way he had given every other, protecting. The boy pressed his forehead against the shepherd's muzzle. He whispered stories back into his ear, the ones he had learned by fire, the ones of the flood, the ridge, the fire, the wolves. He told them not as history, but as memory the dog had made possible. At last, the shepherd exhaled one long, slow breath. His body sagged, his eyes softened, and then they stilled. The boy's cry rose, sharp and piercing, echoing across the highlands. The villagers wept with him, their grief heavy, but laced with reverence. For they knew, this was not the end of an animal's life. It was the closing of a chapter in their own survival. They built a cairn of stone on the hill, overlooking the valley. At its base they carved no words, only the mark of a paw beside the handprint of a child. They needed no inscription. Every soul in the camp carried the story already, burned into their marrow. The boy stood long at the cairn, silent, his small hand resting on the topmost stone. When he finally turned back, his face was streaked with tears, but his eyes carried something steadier than grief. In them burned the same light that had filled the shepherd's gaze, the unyielding fire of protection, of love, that did not break. The villagers saw it and knew, the torch had passed. The boy would grow, and in him the guardian lived on. That night, as stars spread across the highland sky, the settlement felt a strange peace. The shepherd was gone, yet his presence filled them still. He was in the safety of the huts, the laughter of children, the fire that no longer frightened them.
He was in the bond that had carried them through ruin, into renewal. The story would be told for generations, not of storm alone, or fire or hunger, but of a dog and a child, bound so tightly that even death could not unravel them. The fading light had passed, but it had left behind a dawn.